Bonjour film fans, and welcome to this episode of The Sherlockian. Now, with the new Ridley Scott film coming out on Napoleon, I thought it'd be quite cool to have a little look at the trailer and have a bit of a think about what kind of historical events the film's based on and what kind of things we might be seeing in the film itself. Now, first things first, and I should probably get this out of the way straight up. I don't really like Napoleon very much. I mean, this is as a person. I'd had to study him from module at university, and ever since then, I wasn't a massive fan before, but I really sort of developed a quite intense dislike of Napoleon just as a person. He just seemed a really unlikable person. Um, and it's interesting that Ridley Scott himself seems to have kind of this view of Napoleon himself. He was actually quite strongly criticised in the French press not so long back because he'd made some comments about basically comparing Napoleon to Hitler and Stalin. Um, Now the French are up in arms about this. He is, after all, a French national hero. They've got statues up to him. But I have to say that I'm more on Ridley Scott's side than on theirs. I mean, Napoleon did some pretty terrible stuff. Let's be honest. I mean, not only are there the millions dead in his wars that he really didn't have to wage. He pretty much secured the borders of of France by sort of like 1792 or thereabouts. So they were all wars of conquest. But not only that, there were some other acts which nowadays would definitely be considered war crimes, and even back then were considered pretty shocking. So, for example, in what's now Haiti, where there was originally a slave rebellion in the times of sort of the Ancien regime, the French monarchy, um, and basically the slaves had sort of declared their own republic. Napoleon decided that because of obviously he wanted the sugar that was on those islands, he decided to re-invade it. And during which he used sulfur dioxide from the volcanoes on Haiti to gas about 100,000 Haitian prisoners of war, basically, in on like massive sort of like prison ships, located kind of offshore. So that's pretty horrible. There's also the 3,000 or 2,500, depending on which sources you read, Turkish prisoners he took in when he invaded Egypt. They surrendered to him on the assumption, well, not the assumption, the assurance that they were going to be allowed to live. Napoleon probably had them all executed and then just left out in the desert to rot. Um, Now, obviously, there were circumstances, particularly in the latter case, but they're not exactly extenuating, and they show Napoleon as a pretty, well, pretty unlikable person, shall we say. Now, of course, that's not to, exclude all the stuff that Napoleon did. He did obviously, move French law around Europe. A lot of the legal codes of several countries are actually based on the Code Napoleon, which he created, or not created himself, but was created under his rule. And were certain areas of his empire, particularly obviously France and places like Luxembourg and Belgium, that did quite well, and they were kind of considered French enough to be sort of like part of Napoleon's Greater France, and so they kind of benefited under the continental system that he created, economically speaking. But generally speaking, most other places suffered, and I don't like Napoleon. I think this will become quite clear during the course of this review. Having said that, though, I mean, obviously, that doesn't take away from the fact that he was a very interesting historical person, and obviously, it makes him a real ripe subject for film. In fact, he's been in loads. And the thing about Napoleon is he's such a massive figure striding across the face of history that you can't really do a film just about Napoleon. I think you could easily get a trilogy of Napoleon's life. It would be quite easy to do. He just did so many different things. A lot of the same kind of things like conquering, but still, you could definitely get like a Netflix series out of it. And it would run into several seasons. In fact, that's not a bad idea. I should probably suggest that. Anyway, Napoleon was a fascinating person, and there's been loads of different films about different aspects of his life. The one that springs to mind is Désirée, which is the one about Napoleon's relationship essentially with his ex-girlfriend, or ex-fiancée, Désirée Leclerc. I can't even say her name. Désirée Leclerc, I think her name was. And in fact, she ended up marrying one of Napoleon's generals, who then later became King of Sweden, of all things, and helped to bring Napoleon down. So, I mean, that film in itself, I mean, there's quite a lot of, obviously, like artistic license taken with the story. But still, it's an interesting, a very niche aspect of Napoleon's life that somebody thought was worthy of making a film out of. And I think this film seems to have gone a similar kind of way in that it looks at Napoleon's life through his relationship with Josephine. Now, this is an interesting way of looking at Napoleon's life, not least because actually large proportions of his latter life, Josephine wasn't really an active player. She was in his early years, certainly, but after, I don't know, I'm not really good on dates, but basically after he's declared emperor, her influence really begins to wane. And he actually I mean, I'm sure this will be a part of the film, but he actually divorced Josephine quite soon after that and married a Habsburg princess, principally because Josephine was too old to bear children, and Napoleon was now becoming a bit like Henry VIII, kind of obsessed with his legacy, like having an heir to continue his name and his dynasty. Um, which is is certainly a very interesting kind of attitude to have when you've seized power, principally in the name of the people, um, or at least to the advantage of the people, as Napoleon would have had it, when he became consul, um, and then you gradually amassed more and more power, and then finally just become a monarch. But leaving that aside, it certainly is an interesting way to look at Napoleon's life. I must admit that there are some bits of this film I think look absolutely fantastic, and particularly the battle scenes. They really get a brilliant, um, they really get a brilliant idea of how massive Napoleonic battles were. There've been some pretty good shows based on sort of Napoleonic War era battles. Several spring to mind, like Waterloo is a very famous example. Obviously, it just looks at one battle. The Russian version, I think, of War and Peace has a brilliant reenactment of Borodino in it. Obviously, the most famous battle between the Russians and the French during Napoleon's invasion of Russia. That was famous because the director famously made them reshoot it because it turned out afterwards, after the first battle had been shot, that the can't remember which particular unit. I think it might be the Russian soldiers. He said they had the wrong number of buttons on their uniform, so he made them reshoot the entire battle again at vast cost, just to get this tiny detail. Like that's the man for me. A man with such attention to historical detail that he's willing to spend that much money. And of course, the Sharp series. But obviously, for want of budget, some of those films are quite small scale. I mean, Sharp is the famous example. I mean, they managed to do a really good job of conveying quite big battles with very small numbers of people, and you don't really notice until somebody points it out to you. But what this does is obviously having the major budget of a Hollywood film, it can just CGI the heck out of it, and it's a really good example of why CGI is a really effective tool in historical dramas. Some films go a bit over the top. Midway and Pearl Harbor are very obvious examples of this when they CGI everything and it just kind of looks like a video game. But there are other examples, things say like Dunkirk, which are quite good films, but because Christopher Nolan didn't use CGI at all, they end up looking a bit small scale, particularly the aerial shots of Dunkirk, when they have those neat little lines of people queued up on the beach at Dunkirk. And it looks very British, they're all queuing nicely. But, in reality, Dunkirk was Armageddon. I mean, it was people, they were shouting at each other and playing cards, and it was, the place was being constantly bombed by the Luftwaffe. It didn't look like a nice little French, coastal town. It was just, anarchy. And I think that Napoleon seems to be doing a really good job at that. I mean, Ridley Scott is a very famous and very highly regarded director, so it's not really surprising that it looks amazing, and you really get the sense of the chaos and the anarchy and the gore of those kinds of battles. I really like the shot of the massive cavalry charges. There's a lovely shot of I think possibly at Waterloo, where it shows the French cavalry kind of circling the British squares at the climax of the battle, which is a lovely shot. Yeah, there's some absolutely cracking scenes in there. Now, I think it's fair to say they do take some liberties. I mean, this is Ridley Scott after all. I mean, he's famous for taking quite a lot of historical liberties in all his, historical epic films. And I think this one, does its fair share. There's that lovely scene at the end of the trailer at Austerlitz where it shows the French opening fire on, I believe it was the Russians, though I might have got that wrong, on frozen lake. And there's that brilliant shot where Napoleon stands next to his artillery, and they whip the covers off the cannons, and then they open fire, and there's the cannonballs smashing through the surface of the ice, and people are falling in and they're drowning, and the horses are going crazy. And this actually did happen, but probably not quite as I think it's going to happen in the film. This was definitely in the aftermath of the Battle of Austerlitz. Um, so Napoleon had already won by this point, and the Austrians and the Russians were in retreat. And basically, a unit of Allied soldiers ended up on a frozen lake, and they basically were just told by the commander just to get out as best they can. So they've completely lost all order at this point. And then the French artillery opened fire on them, and some of the lake did obviously break because cannonballs and ice really don't mix very well, and some soldiers fell in. Generally speaking, apparently unlike in as it appears to be in the film, the lake actually wasn't very deep, so most of the soldiers didn't actually drown. It was only if they were quite badly wounded that they drowned. Though obviously it was quite cold, so some of them may well have died of exposure, and some others died because obviously it takes quite a long time to get out of a lake, and they were being shelled. I was going to say shelled, not shelled, bombarded at the time. So some of them were killed through that, but quite a few of them did manage to actually escape. And the big difference for me, anyways, and obviously I've only seen the trailer, so I don't know if this is quite how it's going to work in the film, but it looked very much like it was part of the actual battle itself properly, as if Napoleon had somehow tricked the units of soldiers onto the ice, because they had that beautiful shot where somebody wipes the snow off the ground and they see it's ice underneath, and then the French whip the covers off the cannons, and then they all open fire, and as if it's an ambush, it's a trap. But in real life, that didn't happen. I doubt they whipped the covers off the cannons because they were already using them. They just they turned them in a different direction and opened fire. Yeah, so I don't think it probably quite happened like that in real life. But it does look brilliant, and it's a fantastic shot of the cannonballs smashing into the ice and everything going crazy. So I did enjoy that scene. I just don't think it happened quite like that in real life. Um, Other than that, what other bits did I enjoy? Oh, I quite enjoyed, and this is a strange thing to say, but the little moments between Josephine and Napoleon, particularly the love scenes you see very briefly in one of them. You see Napoleon drag her underneath a table. Napoleon was a very passionate kind of man, I think it's fair to say. I mean, he was French after all, but he was passionate in I was going to say a bit of a weird way. He was very hands-on. And that's probably as far as I can go on YouTube. I think it's fair to say. If you want to know more, and you probably don't, but if you read Vincent Cronin's biography of Napoleon, he talks about this in quite some detail about what Napoleon was kind of like, and it definitely was very reminiscent of some of those descriptions. Just that little bit in the trailer, I thought, oh yeah, that really has kind of captured the essence of kind of Napoleon's kind of relationships with women. It felt very, very real to me, almost too real. It kind of made me shudder. I thought, oh yeah, yuck. I remember reading those accounts when I was at uni. I don't want to read them again. Other than that, it does also show you some nice little pieces of Napoleon's life, of nice little historical details about his early years. So, for example, you see how he quells the is often referred to as like a monarchist rebellion on the streets of Paris. How kind of unified it was, I don't know, because I mean they're having riots all the time in Paris at that point. So, and the Directory government was really struggling to keep order. So, whether it was an actual uprising or just kind of another big riot is kind of up to interpretation. But it does show the principal thing it's famous for, which is Napoleon quelled it by using cannons on civilians, which had never been done before. I mean, it was a very, very hard line reaction, rather than just trying to kind of buy them off, which is what the Directory had done up to that point. Which is so it's a nice little historical detail about that. And then there's also another bit which I really, really enjoyed. It also shows you the siege of Toulon, where the British Navy basically captures a French city in kind of support, I think, of another uprising in the south of France. and Napoleon was the principal officer in charge of quelling that uprising, which is brilliant, and the scenes of that look pretty fantastic as well. I like the fact as well it showed you Napoleon leading from the front, which was very much a thing that the French officer corps was famous for. I mean, to be fair, the British officers did it quite a lot as well, but yes, I like the fact it showed you that they're not just kind of behind the lines. Napoleon is actually shown as kind of scaling a ladder. Now, I'm not sure if he actually did that, though it's quite possible he did. But it's a nice little touch. It's even if it's not historically accurate, it's historically authentic to the kind of things that officers were very much expected to do at the time. Napoleon was famous as an artillery officer for standing by his men while they were firing their cannons, charging cavalry, sort of spurring them on. It was very much a part of an officer's duty to be seen, to see and be seen, to kind of walk around, and offer himself as a target, to show how brave he was. And it kind of explains why so many officers, like say Nelson is a famous example, had so many injuries. Nelson had one eye, one arm. Yeah, that's because they were always expected to leave from the front, whether they were in the army or in the navy. And it was a nice little touch to show that, I thought. The one final thing which just springs to mind is the big historical inaccuracy I did notice in the film is the bit in Egypt with the Battle of the Pyramids. Now, this did happen, obviously. Napoleon very easily defeated the Mameluke government in charge of Egypt at the time. But there was a battle called the Battle of the Pyramids, but Ridley Scott has definitely taken a lot of inspiration, shall we say, from paintings of the battle, which show it happening right next door to the pyramids. There's that lovely shot of the kind of the battle in the sort of the foreground and the pyramids right in the background. Now, the Battle of the Pyramids did happen, but it happened about, I think it was over 20 miles away or something from the pyramids. You can see the pyramids from the battlefield, but they're right in the distance. And that is more testament to how big the pyramids are than how close the battle was to the actual pyramids. But obviously, when people painted it, they wanted to show it, with the pyramids right in the background, because that's what it's famous for. So that's what they did. So yeah, overall, I'm quite looking forward to it in a weird kind of way. I don't like Napoleon, and I'm not a huge fan of Ridley Scott generally, but I think it could be quite good. It's certainly an interesting take on Napoleon, and it seems to be kind of doing quite a sort of a broad look at his life. It's sort of different snapshots from throughout his life, rather than trying to cover his entire life in one go, which is not an easy thing to do by any means. In fact, I'd argue in one film it would be virtually impossible. So anyway, that was the Shillocking. Thank you very much for watching. Do feel free to follow me on Twitter if you'd like to. There's a link in the description below. And also subscribe and get some more videos. Once Napoleon the film is out, I'll try and do a review of it and to sort of see how accurate my predictions were. I think it could be quite interesting. I'm also at the moment working on a review of the Poncho Villa series on Disney Plus. So hopefully that'll be out fairly soon. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.